It was 2 o'clock in the night. The quiet and stillness of the house weighed heavily on my heart. I glanced at my 13-year-old husband, Shumeo, who was sleeping deeply, completely unaware of me and the turmoil swirling in my heart. He had no idea what was going on inside me, what battles I was silently fighting within myself. His innocent, peaceful face was a sharp contrast to the storm that raged inside me. We had been married for almost 6 months, a short yet long span of time, in which only I knew how I had struggled to keep my emotions in check. But tonight, everything was different. Tonight, I couldn't hold it in anymore. My heart burned with an unbearable intensity, a longing I had not been able to voice or act upon. It was as if something inside me had finally reached its limit. I quietly slipped out of bed, trying not to disturb Shumeo's peaceful slumber. I went to the kitchen, the cold floor beneath my feet a welcome distraction from the heat in my chest. I reached for a glass of water from the fridge, hoping it would quench the dryness in my throat. But it didn't help. The thirst wasn't just physical, it was something deeper. A thirst for something more than what I had, more than what I was allowed to express. I felt the madness creeping in, the frustration that I could no longer suppress. I walked aimlessly through the house, hoping the movement would calm me, but it didn't. My steps led me toward my father-in-law's room, drawn there by some invisible force. His door was open, as it usually was, and I hesitated for a moment, my heart racing. I stepped into the room, my feet light as air, trying not to make a sound. But then I heard it, the soft hum of his voice. He was awake too. I froze for a second, but then, sensing his awareness, I walked slowly toward him, my footsteps soft on the floor. He got up, his voice filled with concern. "What's the matter, Safina? Why are you still awake?" The words were gentle, but they hit me with a weight I couldn't explain. His concern seemed so genuine, yet I knew the truth of the situation, that none of this was what it seemed to be. I smiled weakly, the gesture feeling foreign on my lips. I reached down and gently placed my hand on his feet, trying to offer some semblance of comfort, even though I was desperate to escape from this suffocating reality. "Everything is fine. I just couldn't sleep," I muttered, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. All night I stayed in his room as though somehow it could help ease the ache in my chest. But deep down I knew nothing would. I felt as if I was caught in an endless loop, bound by responsibilities and expectations that I couldn't escape. And then, just as the night seemed to stretch on forever, there was a sudden commotion in the house. My father had entered the house in a frenzy, scattering things all around, his face twisted in anger. I was immediately alarmed, the chaos taking me by surprise. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran toward him, my mind racing with questions. "What happened, Baba?" I asked, my voice trembling with fear. He looked at me with a fury that sent chills down my spine. "Where are the house papers?" he demanded, his voice harsh. The question hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I froze. I didn't know how to respond, my mind spinning. "What do you mean, Baba? What papers?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Where are they kept?" he asked again, his grip on my hair tightening as he pulled me closer, his face inches from mine. The pain from his grip was excruciating, but it was nothing compared to the fear that gripped me in that moment. "Do you know where they are?" His words cut through me, and I could feel the life draining out of me as I shook my head. I didn't know. I couldn't tell him. The tears welled up in my eyes, blurring my vision. But I didn't dare wipe them away. He looked at me with disgust, as though I were the cause of all his frustration. Without saying another word, he began to scatter everything around him in a fit of rage, desperate to find what he was looking for. His actions were frantic, almost mad, and I knew that if he found those papers, everything would be ruined. I stood there paralyzed by fear, praying silently that he would not find what he was looking for. If he found the papers, the house would be lost. We would have nothing left. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, of how to keep him from uncovering the truth. I started reciting verses in my mind, hoping for some divine intervention, some way to stop him before it was too late. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Baba left the room in a hurry. The tension in the air seemed to dissipate, but I couldn't relax. I quickly grabbed my phone and called Amma, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. Amma, in a state of panic herself, told me she was at my grandmother's house, where my grandmother was near her final moments. I told Amma to stay there and not come back. Baba was still furious, and if she returned, things would only get worse. "You're right," Amma said, her voice weak. "I won't come back. I can't risk it." The call ended, and I was left alone with my thoughts. The house felt like it was closing in on me, and I couldn't escape the suffocating grip of fear and anxiety that seemed to have taken hold of my every breath. The night stretched on, and I knew that there was no easy way out of this mess. My heart ached with a longing for something better, something different, but all I could do was hold on, hoping that somehow things would get better. As I stood there alone in the silence, I realized that this night would be one that would stay with me forever. The uncertainty, the fear, and the pain would never leave me. It was a night that marked a turning point in my life, a moment when I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. My heart was pounding with nervousness. My hands trembled as I began cleaning the mess that had been left behind. It was nothing short of a miracle that Mom had taken the necessary precautions and hidden the house documents before leaving. If she hadn't done that, they would have fallen into my father's hands, and the consequences would have been unimaginable. As I continued to wrap up the things around the house, my tears flowed freely. The weight of everything seemed unbearable. Dad had always had a habit of losing money to gambling, and whenever he lost, he would sell off some household items. Over the years, this had escalated. One by one, valuable things in our house disappeared, sold off to satisfy his addiction. Little by little, everything that had once made our home a home was gone, and nothing remained. Now this house, the very walls that surrounded us, was the only thing that held any value, the only thing that kept us from being completely destitute. It was our last refuge, the only thing left that we could truly call our own. For the past few days, Dad had been talking about selling the house again, a topic that came up repeatedly. Mom, as usual, bore the brunt of his anger, enduring the beatings that came with such discussions. But she never allowed him to sell the house, no matter how much he pressured her. She always found a way to keep it from happening. I thought that once Dad realized he couldn't find the house papers, he would abandon the idea. I convinced myself that he would calm down and let the matter go. But I was wrong. I had underestimated how far Dad was willing to go for money. Without the papers and with Mom not around to stop him, he went ahead with his plan, determined to do whatever it took. That evening when Dad came home, I noticed something strange. There was a mysterious smile on his face, a look I hadn't seen in days. The expression was unsettling, especially since he had been in such a furious state for the past 2 days. His mood had shifted dramatically, and I couldn't understand why. Dad had never once mentioned taking me out for a walk, let alone suggesting something so unusual. He noticed the look of surprise on my face and, with an almost jovial tone, said, "Your mother has gone to another city and forgotten about you, but I haven't forgotten. I know how hard you've been working around the house, always busy. So I thought, why not take you for a little walk?" His words struck me as odd, and I could barely process them. I couldn't fully digest what he was saying, but I didn't dare speak up. My tongue was tied in the presence of my father. I didn't know what he was thinking, but I felt that something was wrong. Still, I didn't resist. After a while, we stood at the door of Shabir Sahib's house in a different neighborhood. I knew Shabir Sahib very well. He was one of Dad's friends, someone he frequently gambled with. I had always disliked the presence of Dad's gambler friends. I didn't like the way they behaved, the way they brought a sense of discomfort and tension to our home. It used to make Mom furious. She would argue with Dad for hours on end, demanding that he not bring these men into our house. But her protests were always ignored. Eventually, it would end with Dad beating Mom and leaving the house in anger. The cycle was always the same. Dad's voice broke my thoughts. "Understand that there is some important work to be done," he said, almost as if he could sense my unease. When we entered Shabir Sahib's house, my anxiety grew even worse. There were several men in the room, men I had never seen before, who seemed to be waiting for us. The atmosphere was tense, and I could sense the weight of the situation. I looked at Dad nervously, my mind racing with confusion. What was going on? What had I walked into? I still didn't understand what was happening, and as time passed, I became more and more agitated. Then one of the men in the room, an entrepreneur who appeared well-spoken and respectable, started talking about marriage. The words were like a blow to my chest. My head swam, and I could feel my heart beating faster. I stood up instinctively, trying to refuse, to run away from the conversation that was unfolding before me. But before I could say anything, Dad reached out and placed a firm hand on my neck, making me sit down again. His grip was unyielding, and I had no choice but to listen. Dad's voice, though calm, carried a sharpness I hadn't heard before. "You don't need to worry, just sit and listen." The words stung as if they were daggers to my very soul. I tried to remain composed, but my thoughts were a whirlwind. How had it come to this? How had I ended up here, in a room full of strangers discussing something so personal, something that would change the course of my life forever? I looked at Dad, searching his face for some sign of what he was really thinking. But his expression was unreadable, and I knew I had no choice but to comply. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of confusion and helplessness. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of the situation, but nothing seemed to add up. All I wanted was to escape, to go back to the life I had before everything had changed. But I knew that wasn't possible. The walls of my world had started closing in on me, and I couldn't breathe. The conversation continued around me, but I couldn't focus. My heart was racing, and I could feel the sweat forming on my brow. I had never felt more trapped, more vulnerable. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but I could sense that my life was about to take a drastic turn. "If you take a word against me or refuse this marriage, I will send a divorce to your mother. When your mother's house is not left, what will she do by saving the house?" my father threatened. His words struck me like a cold, sharp knife, and my mouth went dry. My tongue was locked in place, unable to form any words. I stood there, frozen, looking at my father with disgust. How had he fallen so far? Gambling had consumed him entirely, and it seemed like he had forgotten everything, even the fact that I was his real daughter. The weight of the situation was too much for me to bear. As the marriage ceremony began, I was in shock. I had thought that I would be married to Shabir Sahib, the man who had been arranging this whole situation. But as I listened closely, my world shattered. I realized that I wasn't being married to Shabir Sahib at all, but instead to his 13-year-old son, Shumail. I was so confused and overwhelmed that I couldn't comprehend what was happening. My father had just said, "Accepted, it's done," and that was the end of it. I couldn't even protest, let alone voice my objections. Tears flowed freely from my eyes as I bowed my head in silence, too stunned to do anything else. The ceremony concluded, and the reality of the situation began to set in. Suddenly, a small figure ran towards me, grabbing my hand. "My bride is very much," said the boy with an innocent smile. I jumped in shock, my body frozen for a moment. It was then that I realized the horrible truth. I was not being married to Shabir Sahib, but to his 13-year-old son, Shumail. I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a game, a cruel game being played with my life. I sat down on the sofa in a daze, completely uncertain about what had just happened. My father left me there, almost as if he had no further interest in the situation. "This is your in-laws now," he said coldly. "You have to stay here." I couldn't understand why Shabir Sahib, who was perfectly capable of marrying me himself or resolving things differently with my father, would give his 13-year-old son to me. Why did he choose this path? I couldn't make sense of it. My heart felt heavy with confusion and helplessness. Later that same night, Shabir Sahib called me into his room. There, he revealed the shocking truth behind my marriage to Shumail. There was no woman in Shabir Sahib's house. He needed someone to take care of the household work. He didn't want the traditional constraints of a wife. He was a free-spirited entrepreneur who didn't need the same kind of restrictions that come with marriage. So he decided to marry me off to his son Shumail so that I could take care of him. In return, he had gambled with my entire life, making a decision that would forever alter my fate. I hadn't even had a chance to call my mother and tell her what was happening. I was trapped with no way out. As the night wore on, Shumail forced me to go to his room. I was crying uncontrollably, unable to comprehend the events that had unfolded. "Safina," he said softly, sensing my distress. "Is something wrong?" he asked. His concern was genuine, and for a moment I felt a small glimmer of compassion from him, despite the bizarre situation. I managed to choke out that I missed my mother, that I was overwhelmed by everything that had happened. Shumail sat down next to me and said softly, "I miss my mother too. She's gone from this world." His words hit me with unexpected force. I looked at him in disbelief. This 13-year-old child, in his own sorrow, seemed more aware of the harsh realities of life than I was at that moment. He looked at me with a tenderness that seemed out of place in this chaotic world we were now living in. Shumail seemed to understand my need to speak with my mother, and without hesitation, he ran to Shabir Saib's room, grabbed a phone, and handed it to me. "Safina," he said gently, "you can talk to your mother now. I'll put the phone back when you're done." I grabbed the phone and immediately called my mother. When she picked up, I could barely contain my emotions. I told her everything, the marriage, the deception, and how I was now trapped in a house with a 13-year-old boy as my husband. My mother's reaction was as expected. She seemed to lose all strength at once, her voice breaking as she told me, "I'm coming back. I'm going to talk to your father. Don't give him the papers of the house. He'll use them to get you divorced. Let things cool down for a few days. You know your father's moods change based on his gambling wins. If he wins, he'll be in a better mood, and maybe things will settle." She reassured me that she was fine and that she would handle the situation. I could hear the worry in her voice, but she tried to comfort me as best as she could. After hanging up, I looked at Shumail, who was sitting quietly beside me. Tears filled his eyes as he gazed at me, silently acknowledging the pain that both of us were going through. I had no idea what my future held, but in that moment, I understood one thing. I was no longer in control of my own life. It had been taken from me, and all I could do now was wait for the storm to pass. He was a well-intentioned, lovely child, someone who had now become my life partner, albeit in the most unexpected and painful way. I handed the phone back to him and he returned it to his father before sitting next to me. Then he began to speak about the feelings that weighed heavily on his heart. It seemed he too was yearning for someone's support, someone to understand the inner turmoil he felt, even at such a young age. I gently placed my arm around 13-year-old Shumail, drawing him close to me and reassuring him that he was not alone, that I was with him. I made him realize that despite everything, we were in this together. We started to live together, and I made sure to send him to school regularly, doing my best to be a supportive presence in his life. He was happy with my efforts, and he seemed to find joy in the small routines we shared. But as for my own heart, what could I do with it? It was torn between the burden of forced emotions and the reality of my situation. Most nights I would sit up and watch Shumail sleeping peacefully beside me, my heart breaking silently. He was a small child, my husband by forced circumstance, but I couldn't help but see him from a different perspective, the perspective of an older sister, a protector. It was incredibly difficult for me to view him as a husband. The thought of it felt so unnatural, and my emotions seemed to trap me in a cage of helplessness. My heart yearned for a man who could love me, who could fulfill my emotional and physical needs in a way that made sense for a young woman like me. But instead, I had a child by my side, a child who needed love and care in a way I could give as a sister, but not as a wife. As time passed, the bond between Shumail and me grew, but the essential connection needed for a marital relationship was impossible to establish. There was no desire between us, no romantic or sexual bond. For me, this was a crushing reality. A pure emotion like love, something that a young girl like me could cling to, was essential. How long could I suppress my own heart, stifling my emotions for the sake of what was expected of me? One night, the weight of everything became too much. I reached the point where my patience was completely exhausted. I couldn't carry on this charade any longer. I left the room quietly, stepping into the cold, empty hallways of the house. Even though the house was chilly, I could feel beads of sweat on my skin, my body betraying my internal struggle. The turmoil inside me was unbearable. I had no idea to whom I could voice my heartache, no one to turn to. I didn't even know if anyone would understand. Shumal was lying on the bed, humming softly to himself, his innocence shining through. I felt a deep sense of grief for him, for myself, for the twisted circumstances we had been thrust into. I walked quietly over to his feet, sitting down next to him. I let out a long, exasperated sigh, not even realizing how loud it was. Shabir Sahib, who had been sitting nearby, turned at the sound of my voice. He looked at me and smiled, a gentle, almost sad smile. "What's the matter, Safina? You haven't slept yet?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. But the concern seemed to be aimed at something deeper than just my lack of sleep. There was a hint of anxiety in his voice, a fear that I wasn't as content as I had let on. I sighed once more, the burden in my heart too heavy to keep inside. I spoke softly, trying to keep my emotions in check, but they slipped out in a rush. "After so long, someone has finally pressed my feet," I said quietly, recalling his words. "When Shumail's mother was alive, she used to do this for me every day." His words stirred something deep inside me, a mix of pity, anger, and confusion. I could see the years of pain reflected in his eyes, and yet I couldn't escape the fact that he had created this situation. With a slight tremor in my voice, I asked, "If this is how you feel, then why didn't you marry me yourself? Why did you choose Shumail?" He was stunned by my question. For a moment, he sat up straight, his eyes wide in disbelief. "What do you mean, Safina?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with confusion. I couldn't keep it inside anymore. The words I had held back for so long came rushing out. "By what you're doing now, you've ruined Shumail's life. You've ruined mine too," I continued. "I am a young girl. I have needs, I have desires, and yet you've bought me in exchange for my father's compulsions. You've given me to a little boy who doesn't even understand what it means to be married. He thinks I'm just his bride, but he doesn't know what a marriage requires. He doesn't understand the responsibilities, the emotional connection that should exist between husband and wife. He doesn't know how to meet my needs, and I'm not sure he ever will, not at his age. Even when he grows up, there will always be this age gap between us. This relationship can never be what it should be." My heart was heavy with all the unsaid words, and I felt a momentary sense of relief as I spoke the truth. But the truth was painful, and it felt like a betrayal of the life I had tried so hard to build for myself, even in the face of overwhelming odds. I wasn't sure how I could continue living this way, with no emotional fulfillment, no romantic connection. All I wanted was to feel whole again, to feel seen and loved, not as a caretaker, not as a forced bride, but as a woman, a human being with her own desires and needs. I suddenly realized that Shabir Sahib, for all the faults I had once attributed to him, was not the man I had thought him to be. He had, in fact, done me a great favor, a favor that was hard to understand at the time. I had called him a bad, evil gambler, but now, looking back, I saw him in a completely different light. He had protected my honor when I had felt so alone, when my entire world seemed to be falling apart. He had saved me from a fate that could have been far worse than the one I was already trapped in. Shabir Sahib placed his hand gently on my head, as though he were offering me a blessing. His prayer was quiet but sincere, and with each word the fire in my heart began to extinguish. The pain that had once consumed me started to fade, replaced by a sense of calm I had longed for. I realized then that I was safe with him. It wasn't the relationship I had initially hoped for or imagined, but it was real and it was mine to navigate. I had left it to Shumail to decide where this relationship would go, whether he wanted to continue it or end it, but I had learned to accept whatever outcome might come. Then one evening, Shumail surprised me. He came to me, a look of sincerity in his eyes that I had never seen before. Gently, he placed his head on my chest, and I could feel the warmth of his words as he spoke. I love you, Safina. I want to start our married life anew, with you, together. His words struck me deeply, stirring emotions I had buried for so long. Shumail, my 13-year-old husband, was no longer just the boy I'd been forced to marry. He was someone who truly cared for me, who had grown into a young man with feelings and desires, despite his age. His confession was not just a declaration of affection, it was an acknowledgement of the bond we had formed. A bond that had been forged not out of obligation, but out of understanding and mutual respect. Around this time, tragedy struck. My father, the man who had brought so much turmoil into our lives with his gambling addiction, met his end. His addiction had consumed him completely, and in the end, it was the very thing that led to his downfall. My mother, widowed and heartbroken, now had to bear the weight of this loss. Yet in the midst of our grief, Shumail stepped forward, taking on the responsibility of caring not only for me, but also for my widowed mother. His actions touched me deeply. The boy who had once been thrust into a marriage he didn't fully understand had now become the pillar of support I had always needed. He was no longer just the innocent child I had thought him to be. He had matured in ways I hadn't expected. He had taken on a role that no one could have foreseen, and in doing so, he had become a source of strength for both my mother and me. As time passed, I saw the true goodness in Shumail. He wasn't just fulfilling his role as my husband, he was providing for us, offering love and support in ways I had never imagined. My heart swelled with gratitude, and I realized that despite the rocky start to our marriage, God had guided us towards something beautiful. My work was done, my honor preserved, and my house settled. What had once felt like a curse was now a blessing, and I couldn't help but feel thankful for everything that had brought us to this point. It was as though everything had fallen into place. My life, once uncertain and full of pain, had found its direction. Shumail and I, together with my mother, had formed a new family. A family built on respect, understanding, and love. We didn't need to be a traditional family to be happy. All we needed was each other. I looked around at the home we had created, the one my father had wanted to sell, the one that had almost been taken from us. And in that moment, I understood the true value of what we had. We were no longer bound by the mistakes of the past. We had moved forward, together, stronger than ever. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. With Shumail by my side and with my mother's strength, we would face whatever came our way. In the end, I had found peace, not through traditional means, not by the standards others might have set for me, but through the love and care I had for Shumail and the support we had for one another. The journey had been hard, but it had led us to a place of hope and healing. And for that, I was truly thankful.